So we are talking about our particular approach to church life, to ministry, to leadership, and our place in the world as being and doing church. And we see it first and foremost through the glasses or the lenses of the theology of the kingdom of God. And what I did in the first session is so brief on the kingdom that it almost does an injustice. And maybe you need to read Derek Morphew's book, Breakthrough, to really come to terms with the understanding of the kingdom and then therefore its implications in defining church. But at least that's the first framework, the biblical theological framework of the kingdom. Now, John Wimber developed a second framework called the sociological lenses, looking at church through the discipline of sociology as to how communities and societies organize themselves. Any group of people, whether it's a nuclear family or whether it's some kind of a community or church or society, they have some arrangements of their common life together, of organizing their common life, their community life. And sociologists developed this in the 40s, 50s, and 60s that then came into language that then John Wimber began to use and examine church life through sociological models, and then said, we want to pursue this model of organizing our life together. It's a helpful way of understanding it. So let me then talk about what this means. So the kingdom of God is the first framework, and our identity as Vineyard is that we theologize in terms of the kingdom, but we practice in terms of the power of the Holy Spirit, because the kingdom brings and is the power of the Holy Spirit. But we also have what we call an integration of language and truth. We don't only use biblical categories and the language of Bible or theology, but we also learn from society and other disciplines. And we had a phrase in the early days that went like this: all that is in the Bible is true, but not all truth is in the Bible. Now let me pause and let that sink in. Think about that. Do you agree with that? All that is in the Bible is true, but not all truth is in the Bible. As an example, 10 plus 10 equals 20. Can you give me chapter and verse that teaches us that? I can. It's the book of Hezekiah, chapter 3, verse 9. Hezekiah was a king. He's not a book. But if you look at the discipline of mathematics, the discipline of medical science, the discipline of anthropology, of philosophy, of engineering, all the human disciplines that we've learned over years, surely there is a lot we can learn that is true in there that is not explicitly discussed in the Bible. Right? You know, to be fundamentalist, you know this horrible word? To be a fundamentalist Muslim, a fundamentalist Christian, a person who is a biblicist, is a person who takes this book literally and believes everything that we all ought to know is only in this book, and we must close our minds to anything else. It's what you call prejudice, which goes like this: don't confuse me with the facts, because my mind is already made up. If you present any new information to me, I just screen it out, because I know the truth and that's it. So John Wimber, and you need to understand this, because this is part of our undergirding values. It has affected our life and ethos and the way we see church. We integrate truth all the time. We are working at being relevant to our current culture and changing context by listening to it, learning from it, to interact with it in a prophetic way to break through with the kingdom, as opposed to closing ourselves off in a cocoon of biblical language and subculture. So all that is in this book we believe is true, and we work with it, and it's our basis for life and living, but we integrate truth that we learn from other disciplines. Therefore, we can learn from sociology. We can learn from psychology. And again, through a guy called Jack Sims, who worked with John Wimber in the early days, they intentionally integrated language in the Vineyard and developed language that was non-biblical or non-religious or church language, but was language accessible and understandable out there in the world, in the workplace, that people could relate to. That's why we talk of values. Do you find the word values in the Bible? Priorities, practices. That's all language from sociology. So let's look then at, the purpose of this idea is to be culture relevant, as opposed to progressively becoming a Christian subculture that increasingly becomes irrelevant in any society. So the continual challenge is to read what's going on in the context around you and keep growing and shifting and changing to be relevant, not in a way of absorbing and becoming a clone of, but in a way of learning from, in order to prophetically engage and infiltrate and change, be leaven in the society. So the three sociological models of how communities organize themselves and operate was what was then developed and taught in the early days, which I've recorded in the book Doing Church. And let me then go through them with you, and hopefully it'll explain to you of how churches arrange their affairs and how we do church, because various kinds of churches can be represented in all three of these models. And then also, by using sociological models to view church and to do church, it also helps us to use disclaimer language. And disclaimer language is, as opposed to, let me say, absolute language. Absolutist language is, I'm right, you're wrong. I'm better and you worse. Disclaimer language is, I'm doing it this way, you're doing it that way, it's just different because it's based on a different frame of reference or different values. And I don't want to condemn you and I don't want to reject you, but I know what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, and I want to honor and respect you and just bless you. Unless, of course, there is an ethical issue involved. When it comes to ethics, that is sin, then it's either right or wrong. But if it's not ethics, then we can live well together with differences and not disparage one another, but use disclaimer language by saying, you're doing it in your way and I'm doing it in my way, but what we actually mean is I'm doing it in the Lord's way. You've heard people say, you do it in your way and I'll do it in the Lord's way. That's like, I am of Paul, I'm of Apollos, but I'm of Christ. We put ourselves above the others. And of course, we don't want to do that. So using secular language into which we put Christian meaning helps us to not appear to be holier than thou and superior, and we right and you wrong. But we can relate in a way that gives honor, but yet at the same time has integrity, where we respect our differences and we hold to our values and we do church the way we do without arrogance or superiority. I hope that that's clear. So let's look at the first model. The first model is what we call the fuzzy set model. Sociologists, in studying certain societies, came up with this model that is called the laissez-faire. You've heard of the French word laissez-faire, where some communities, some societies go through periods of time, or also would try to even be based on the principle of complete freedom, which can be called anarchy, or no form or structure. But basically, in the name of freedom, people can do what they want and there's no cohesion. Everyone on the arrows there, you can see everyone is pulling in their own direction in different ways, for different reasons and for different purposes. And this kind of anarchic, laissez-faire, loose, formless structure, at least environment, is anti-structure and it's anti-leadership. We do not want anyone to really rule over us or tell us what to do or control us, but we're all adults and we can do our own thing in the name of mutual freedom. And of course, there's a verse in the book of Judges that says, there was a time in Israel where there was no king. and everyone did what was good and right in their own eyes. Do you remember that verse in the book of Judges? In other words, without any leadership, the people then basically are left to do what they want to do, when they want to do it, how they want to do it, and community falls apart. It's what we call a phantom community, a phantom church, where it is so laissez-faire, it's so laid back, there's no order, there's no structure, and often implicit in this type of mentality, in this type of concept, is actually resentment of leadership, resentment of authority, anti-authority, anti-structure. Let me just make maybe a few sensitive comments, hopefully sensitively. But we in South Africa have different new movements emerging, the house church movement, the emerging church movement. And there's different experimentations at church. And we came out of the hippie era where the hippies basically rebelled against their parents and really wanted free love, free sex, freedom. It was an anarchic period of just everyone doing their own thing. It affected church life in Calvary Chapel and others, and Vineyard also came out of the revival that came out of the Jesus people. But we are going back into another era where people want to throw off restraint, throw off leadership, throw off structure, and the common phrase is, it's too structured, it's too tight, it's too controlling, it's too this, it's too institutional, and we want to be free to do our own thing. And so there's a plethora, an explosion of experimentation with no accountability and not much leadership. And we have to be careful that we don't end up becoming the phantom church, where people say, we don't believe in denominations, and we don't believe in meetings. We just relate, and we love one another, and we just hang out as the Lord leads us. And if the Lord leads me, I'll talk to you. If the Lord doesn't lead me, I'll hang out with someone else. And if we hang out and just be and love each other as Jesus told us, that's the essence of what it's all about. But if you upset me, I can hang out with someone else. So this is the kind of concept. And again, this has not been a big issue, but it is becoming a big issue with all the experimentation that's going on in these various names. And we need to be careful, because the mood of various generations tends to determine and overflow into the church and causes a lot of self-doubt and self-questioning. And if we are not aware of the shift of the moods in society, we will not be able to cope and give healthy answers, proactive answers. We'll become defensive and reactive to these various things, which we don't really need to be. So that's the fuzzy model, the fuzzy set, and we don't buy into this set as Vineyard. Next is the bounded set, the model of how communities organize themselves, how churches organize themselves. We call the bounded set. The bounded set looks like this. It is really built on dominant, centralized leadership. Strong, dominant, central leadership that reinforces strong boundaries. And the strong boundaries of that community through particular teaching and rules and regulations begins to create an in-out mentality. If you uphold the boundaries and you do what I say, you're in. If you don't uphold the boundaries, our rules, and you don't do what I say, you're out. And of course, the boundaries in terms of church life, generally, churches go like this. They say, if you are a member here and you commit in membership, and if you tithe regularly, if you attend regularly, if you don't commit any major sins, and if you obey the leader and don't clash with the leader, then you're in. But if you don't uphold any of these boundaries, then you're out. Ship up or shape out. No. Shape up or ship out. And it's generally because leadership is singular, individual, central, dominant, and even autocratic. It's what I call the man of God syndrome. And it creates a we-they mentality. We are like this, they are not like us. And if they want to really experience what God is doing, they're going to become like us. They're going to join us. It's this we-they mindset. And people control groups and crowds of people ideologically through we-they, through continually reinforcing the boundary and shaming the people if they dare to go close to the boundary. And then, of course, it creates a right-wrong mentality. We are right, and the people who don't do it the way we do, they are wrong. And the way that relationships, at least the way that people are seen in this type of environment, the bounded set model, is people are seen as a collective whole, as numbers. They're not treated, let alone to be seen, or they're not seen, let alone to be treated as unique individuals with a unique history and a name and pain. But they are treated as numbers. How many bummers basically can we get on the seats? Oh, sorry, is that offensive use of language here? But how many posteriors can we get onto the seat? That's the British polite way of saying it. But normally, in this type of environment, the church is seen as hierarchical from top down, and the singular leader who calls all the shots basically treats the people like his kind of children, and it's a hierarchical power structure of a collective whole. And so therefore relationships in this environment operate top down, parent to child. And of course the man of God, he's the anointed one who has the vision for the church, makes the decisions for the church, and basically he's the parent, and we all remain in a child ego state, dependent on our leader, listening and following in an unhealthy way. That's you're controlled and manipulated to staying in by guilt and shame and performance. So let me summarize the values that undergird this model of community organization called the bounded set. These are some of the values that undergird this. What is really valued most are numbers and budgets. Basically, it's business. You know, business, at the end of the day, it's the bottom line of the money, the numbers that count. And if we do church that way, God help us. Church is not a business. It's not a company. It's not even an organization. It's an organism. It's a family. It's God's family. We need organizational dynamics for cohesion and accountability, but it is not an organization. So numbers and budgets, if that begins to triumph as the determining factor, then you're into a game where you're playing church and you want to grow this thing just to get people in to make up the budget so we can do this, that, and the next thing. And it's the entirely wrong way around. You know, John Wimber used to say, when it came to finances, he said it's easy. Jesus, when he was questioned and had to pay taxes, and they had no money to pay the taxes, he said, go catch a fish. And when you catch the fish, you'll find a coin in its mouth and give that to the taxman. Do you remember that little quaint story in the Gospels? And what John Wimber used to say is, if we are fishers of people, if we go and love people, heal them of their sicknesses, forgive them of their sins, and we win them for the kingdom, out of them comes the money that will pay for the ministry. But if we go looking to get people in order to make money to do what we want to do, then it becomes a driven thing on worldly principles that's actually business. So that's the first value that undergirds the bounded set. The second value that undergirds the bounded set is programs and promotion. That everything is built around programs and promoting. And again, it doesn't mean that programs, and it doesn't mean that promotion is wrong. All it means is what drives the environment. We need programs, and you'll see later, I talk a lot about programs, and we need a certain amount of promoting in the sense of informing and letting people know. But if what drives the environment is programs and promotion, you have a program-driven church where people all perform in the programs to meet the expectations of the leader, and then you are evaluated in terms of whether you are performing well and you are upholding the program or not. And then everything becomes driven by visibility, position, promotion, marketing, etc., etc. And again, that's not what true church is really all about. Visibility and success is the other value that drives the bounded set model. Success by all means possible. Performance and attendance. People have to perform to be in. They have to perform to be recognized. And if they don't perform and if they don't attend regularly, they are not valued. Their worth goes down in the eyes of the leadership. You're only worthy to us and you're valued if you perform, if you attend, if you show up, if you do things. But if you're in pain and you need to be loved, we'll just give you a little bit of time, but we really value those who are in the system and making the system go and grow. So again, we have to be aware that we cannot buy into those values. Evangelism, as in proselytizing in order to survive, becomes the order of the day, because the bounded set creates a closed, strong boundaries, but in order to survive, you've got to proselytize through promotion and get people in for this thing to keep going. And therefore, indoctrination and conformity to how we do things becomes of ultimate importance. We do it this way, and if you don't do it this way, then rather leave. So you've got to conform. We indoctrinate you to get you into our system, and if you don't do it like that, then it's not going to work for us. Not much flexibility, not much grace, a lot of performance, a lot of hidden manipulation and control through guilt and shame. Sociologists have done studies of like Asian communities and other communities as to the undergirding values that drive certain communities. And this thing of honor and shame drives a lot of, especially Asian communities, but also in Africa. It's a big thing in Africa. And of course, you see in the Bible how the values of the kingdom of God fundamentally challenge these hidden values of honor and shame that drive societies and create certain mindsets and build values into a community where people are manipulated and controlled through performance, success, ethic, progress all the time, program, visibility, etc. So I hope you have an understanding of that. And I always ask when I teach this, I say, have you seen this movie before in church life? and then what normally I get is most of the people actually raise their hands and say, yeah, been there, seen that, done that, got the t-shirt, and as well as all the scars on my back. Let me say, I came out of an environment where a number of these values were dominant, and I ended up being exhausted, having to perform as the man of God. And I remember when I first met John Wimber and sat and listened to him talk about the kingdom, about life, about church, something deep inside me said, whew, I can now relax and just be myself. I don't have to perform anymore and get the show on the road and hype people up, promote, push and pull, advertise together. I can just relax and say, Lord, if you don't show up, nothing's going to happen here. Lord, it's a whole reversal of a philosophy when I met and what John Wimber was trying to do and was trying to teach and say as to the values that would undergird a vineyard type of church. So let me look at that now in terms of the third model, the third sociological model that determines how we try to do church in Vineyard. It's called the centered set model. And it's different to the bounded set in this way that the center is not an individual leader who tends towards autocratic leadership, but rather is a team that embodies certain kingdom values where there are checks and balances because of our human carnality and our ego and our need for power. A team that leads through a lived life where they are expressing the values of the kingdom. And of course, we need to pause to say, and it'll come out later in the seminar when I talk about personnel, every team needs a leader, or else it goes nowhere fast. And every leader needs a team, or he will tend towards autocracy. Because every team keeps a leader accountable and humble. And every team needs a leader, or else they go nowhere. It becomes a democratic committee. You hear what I'm saying? So, but the emphasis here is on, as opposed to program-driven church, which is the bounded set through autocratic leadership, we talk about value-led church. I like to use the word led. I want to just refer to Rick Warren and the Purpose-Driven Church, the book, The Purpose-Driven Church, which has been enormously helpful. And as my colleague says, that he learned a lot from the Vineyard and rewrote it in a way. But I prefer the word as opposed to purpose-driven, because there's something deep inside my spirit, or let me be a bit proud or presumptuous. There's something deep inside my spirituality that reacts against anything that is driven. So I don't like the driven church. I like the presence-led church before we are purpose-driven. Because if you don't have the presence, you actually have no purpose. And God's presence always leads us. Remember, through the wilderness, the pillar of fire and the cloud, it led Israel, it didn't drive Israel. We need to be the presence-led church and the values-drawn church. Values draw us to the center. Values draw us into living like God lives, as opposed to drives us. And only then, in a sense, your sense of mission and purpose. Because Paul does say that the love of God compels me. So there is a healthy sense of drivenness. Anyway, that's a little bit on the side. What I'm trying to say is, at the center of the centered set is a small community, a small team of people who embody and live out the values of the kingdom in such a way that they draw other people towards the center because they like what they see. They like the quality of person and the type of life that these people are living, because they're living out the values that actually create the ethos of this whole environment. So the centered set model is concentric circles that goes outward from the center. If you throw a stone in a pond and it drops in the pond and you have all these concentric circles going outwards, that is the idea, that from the center, and I mean, if we really want to be now spiritual, we say Jesus is the center. Jesus and the kingdom. If 2 or 3 gather in my name, what did Jesus say? I am among them. I am in their midst. I am in the center. And we gather around the person and the presence. That leads to the purpose. But if you don't have the person and the presence, you will have no purpose. So the essence and the center of church is the person and the presence of God. And then, as we gather around His presence, we get values and mission and purpose that then kind of goes outwards in ripple effects. And people who meet and come into our environment, they integrate from the outside inwards through different levels of integration. So here is the idea up on the PowerPoint of levels of integration. People come into our environment and they integrate into the community of faith, into the congregation, through levels of relationship as they integrate and grow towards the center. And they're growing towards a vision and a value set of becoming like Jesus, of being Jesus to this world, which we would love to call the values of the kingdom of God, that are embodied and lived out in an exemplary life within the leadership, that don't drive the people, but draw the people. Hear the difference? And so we evaluate, or rather in this environment, we create a relational environment that is adult-to-adult relationships as opposed to parent-to-child relationships in the bounded set model. We treat people as equals with mutual respect because we don't want to control and we don't want to be controlled, so we practice adult-to-adult relationships, and we let people come in at their own pace with their different levels of integration to grow towards health, wholeness, participation, commitment, and ministry towards the center, so that hopefully if they stay with us long enough, they too learn to live a bit more like Jesus through serving, caring, and through loving people. And so, I mean, as an example, I had a burnt out a colleague from a different denomination, a pastor who was utterly burnt out and broken, and rocked up at the Vineyard one day. And I knew him from previous fraternal meetings, but I saw him in the meeting, and he just sat there in the service on a Sunday. And when the worship began, you know the Vineyard songs. I mean, some of them are so intimate. He just started to weep and cry, and I went up to him and I just loved him and blessed him. And you know, as I got to know this guy, in terms of his pain and his burnout, I just realized, give him big space. Let him integrate at his own level of growth towards wholeness. Because of course, the pastor leadership mind in me was saying, aha, he's a pastor. He can help us in this way. He's got these and these gifts. And of course, I was already strategizing as to how now to, in a sanctified way, use this guy to bless our church, you know. But you know, it took that guy 6 months of weeping almost every service just to begin to get back into God's presence and to start healing up. So we made big space to just let him come at his own pace and treat him with dignity, with respect, as an equal, and not to use him for our purposes, but to honor him and celebrate him as a gift from God, that in God's way, God's time, through relationship and growing health, he would naturally, organically enter into participation and emerge through the ranks from the bottom up. And then his gift would make room for him. And that's treating people as adults as opposed to parenting people through a process. And so we treat people with individual dignity as opposed to a collective whole. We don't see people as a collective, as numbers, as bums on the seat, but we want to treat each person as an individual with dignity and respect, because each person has a unique face, a name, a unique history of pain. And we need to love people and not use them for our system to achieve our vision. And that's really, I'll tell you something, I'm talking as a leader here. For many years in the ministry, and I've got to continually work with my lower nature, because as a leader, you want to do things, you want to get things right, you want to draw, you want to use. And at the same, there's this tension of the kingdom inside me. Love him, bless him, pray for him, spend time. At the same time, Lord, it's time now. They should get involved. You know, you want to coax them in, you want to stretch them, you want to grow them. So it's what I call the spirituality of leadership. This environment demands great spirituality of leadership, or else, again, it can either fall apart or just meander. The tendency can be that it's too laid back. But we want to treat people with dignity and as individuals, and not as a category or a label or a group or a collective whole. Because each person is important to God. And therefore we assess people not on the basis of are they in or out. Not on the basis of are they performing or are they not performing. We assess people directionally, what we call directional assessment. If people who come into our environment, they start attending the service and they just sit and they worship. They come maybe every third or fourth weekend. Then they start coming every second weekend. And then they start connecting with some people. Maybe they might even come up for ministry. Then they are invited to a small group. Then they are invited to a meal. And as they grow into the church through worship, then through connecting, then through relating, then through small groups, quickly, or rather sooner or later, they'll begin to touch and feel the values of this environment. What makes this people tick? What makes this church tick? And slowly but surely, as they come in, they start hitting the core values, and then they will realize this is home for me, or it's not home for me. And if they start realizing this is not home for me, I don't really fit here, then they can easily migrate outwards without being judged or labeled or us taking it personally. John Wimber used to say, easy come, you can come easily into the vineyard, and if you want to leave, you can also leave easily as well, without being judged or condemned. But as people come into the vineyard and integrate through our levels of integration via relationship, and they discover more and more the values, the ethos, what our vision, what makes us us, and they like it, and they say, this is home for me. Of course, then they commit, and they grow, and they commit at ever deeper levels of participation. There was a phrase, again, and forgive me, well, I shouldn't actually be apologetic, but forgive me for continually referring to John Wimber and his phrases. I have been accused back in South Africa by my frequent references to John Wimber that I idolize him. And my simple explanation is no ways. I worked with John Wimber for 8 months, and as he used to say, I worked under his armpit, and it got very hot there sometimes. I know John from working with him, and believe you me, he was a very ordinary human being. By his own confession, he said, I'm just a fat man trying desperately to get to heaven. So he was no saint. So I'm not idolizing John Wimber, but let me tell you, I learned a lot from him. And God used them to sow into this movement as founder leader these core values. So when I refer to him, I'm just referring to what I've learned. So he had a phrase that used to go like this: you don't join the vineyard, you find out that you are vineyard. And by that he meant that as you come into our environment, the ethos and the values reflect back to you what you intuitively, instinctively are groping for and looking for as the kind of church that you want to belong to. And what is happening here gives words to what you cannot give words to, but you long for deep inside you. And you discover when you meet this place, this feels like home. This is my kind of people. I can just relax and be myself. I don't have to perform. I'm not going to be manipulated and controlled. I can just be me and accepted for who I am, and I can learn and grow through love, acceptance, and forgiveness. And so the values actually mirror back to people as they come into the environment, whether it's home or not, and they can make a decision, if this is not home for me. We've had folk from different other church traditions come into our church, and after 5-6 months, I've actually said to some of them from time to time, I can see this is awkward for you, and you're struggling. We do things in a way that sometimes offends you, and you try to impose on us your expectations of how we ought to do things. And you know what? There's a little church down the road. Should I name it? It's a little Anglican church down the road. I think that environment would actually you'd be far more happy and productive for God there, because this is becoming frustrating for you. And you can see people after a while. It either fits or it doesn't fit. And so we can receive people, and we can bless people and release them, because the church is bigger than us. The church is the whole church, and God's doing many different things in many different churches, and we don't need everyone in the vineyard. There's no ways. We're not here to make everyone into us, right? So this is the mindset and mentality. People can come and people can go without hopefully any big fights and manipulation and control. God forbid. We all have been injured in church life, haven't we? And so we want to live with grace and assess people directionally. What direction are they traveling in life? Are they going towards the same values and the same vision of the kingdom that we are? If you are journeying towards the same vision and values of the kingdom as we are, then join us and do it with us. Journey with us. As long as God puts you here, if God takes you on, bless you. We release you and send you. But we don't want to evaluate you and judge you by performance and attendance, etc. So let me summarize the values that I've been talking about in the centered set model. This is the brief summary. The centered set model works by an environment of love, acceptance, and forgiveness. We create an environment where we love people unconditionally, accept them, and seek to forgive, cleanse, and heal them up. from their pain and their struggle in life. Evangelism, therefore, is a natural outflow or overflow of the health and life that's growing here, as opposed to a kind of intentional program where we're going to whip people into evangelism and get them out there and motivate them with guilt. Because all healthy things grow. All healthy cells in the body multiply, right? And there's a guy called Christian Swartz who's written a book called Natural Church Growth. And John Wimber, before he died, got hold of that book, and I remember him saying to Costa and myself and Bob Fulton, saying, this book, if I could have written this book, I would have. This represents us. Natural church growth as opposed to technological manipulative church growth, or as opposed to the spiritual paradigm that just says, just pray and trust God and God will do the rest. The middle is make the environment and the people healthy. People grow and they multiply and they draw and they bring others in because of an overflowing joy and health that's coming into their lives. This environment or values, we value relationship and process, adult to adult relationship, and we treat people in process. People are in process on a journey, and we take them through a journey towards health and discipleship and ministry and leadership, and eventually we send them back out there. We nurture and equip people as opposed to get them to perform. We want to nurture, grow people, equip them to do ministry. And we work through teamwork and through modeling as opposed through organizational dynamics and top-down management. It's equipping people, working in teams, modeling ministry, and drawing, growing, motivating people from within, not from outside of them. And so we draw people, and we are not driven. We don't want to drive people. So that is a summary of the core values that undergird the centered set model. I'm coming to in the last slide. How does this work out in terms of commitment in the church and membership in the church? And the reason why I've asked this question, and I do discuss this in the book Doing Reconciliation, is because in the early days of the Vineyard, very few vineyards had any concept of membership. It was just whoever is here, whoever shows up, we just work with them. But again, in talking it through with John Wimber, he spoke about a dynamic view of membership as opposed to a static view of membership. A static view of membership basically says, if you do these 5 things and you sign on the bottom line, you can be a member. A dynamic view of membership says, you literally integrate towards the center by increasing commitment and increasing participation and increasing health in your life. As you get healed up, as you relate, as you join a small group, as you receive ministry, you get healed up, you learn to minister, it's modeled to you, then you minister well, then you go into training, and then you become part of a ministry team, and in the ministry team you do well, you emerge as a leader, and as a leader you lead something, and then you are sent back out again. And so it's a dynamic concept of ever-increasing commitment, deeper levels of participation through relationship as you become known, as opposed to a static concept where you do 5 things and you sign on the bottom line and now you remember. But we all have, or let me say we all have, let me talk for myself. We have a membership course, our people go through it, and then at some point they do make a formal commitment where they say, I commit to be a part of this church. So that if there are any issues later on that are required for discipline or church governmental issues or voting issues, we know who are the committed members of the church. And I think there's a healthy place to have that. So we talk of the levels of relationship and involvement that in a sense make you deeper and deeper in membership in the church. But there is a clear point of commitment that we have through an orientation process or a membership course. We call it exploring membership. And at the same applies to other churches wanting to become vineyard churches. Because sometimes churches want to join the vineyard, and we talk about adopting churches into the vineyard through a dating process, but our priority is clearly to plant churches as vineyard as opposed to adopting new churches into the movement. And I just put this in here again for the sake of leaders and pastors who work with other churches who become friends of the Vineyard and then maybe want to join the Vineyard. And we go through kind of a relational dating process where they imbibe our values and eventually make a commitment to become part of the family. So that's our understanding of commitment and membership. So to finish off with, here are some questions for discussion in small groups. What's the value of an integrated approach to truth and to language, the usage of language and culture? Are there any dangers in using an integrated approach to truth? Discuss how you have experienced the bounded set and or the fuzzy set in your church life experience. Have you experienced that in your church life? And what is the essential value of a centered set approach to church life? Are there any weaknesses in the centered set approach that you can identify? And then also, how do you join the Vineyard? How is commitment understood and expressed in a Vineyard church? Thank you. That's it.